Hello everybody, my name is Anna Horden and this is a lesson plan for 4th and 5th grade ESL, for the 4th and 5th grade ESL classroom. To start, I want to apologize for not being able to actually record myself in a classroom today. I had actually okayed this project with administration about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and they seemed totally fine with it, gave me the okay. But yesterday, when it was time to record my lesson, they came in and said that a parent had complained about the upcoming recording. I went ahead and I did the lesson anyway because that is what I had planned for the day. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk through the lesson step by step, and I'm going to do my best to accurately describe what my students said and did during the time that they were working. If you have any questions about anything that I did during this lesson, or if something is unclear, please feel free to contact me so that I can provide more information. Thank you for bearing with me through this. To start, it's probably best to talk a little bit about the class. This is an extremely small classroom that meets once a week after school. And when I say small, I mean that it ranges anywhere from 2 students at the least to 10 at the most. For this week's class, I had 6 students in attendance. 5 were Japanese and 1 student was Mexican. I have known these students for about 4 months. All 6 of these children have been in the United States for less than a year. None of them have passed their WIDA exam, and all are in their some sort of ESL extra help at their public school. Aside from my 1 Spanish student, most of these students are not planning on staying in America for the rest of their lives. Most of them, their fathers are here on work visas that expire after anywhere from a year to 2. So they are not exceptionally motivated to learn English because they know that it's not particularly necessary for their success. They don't need to know English to survive. There's a strong Japanese community where this school is in Novi, Michigan, so you can survive there only knowing Japanese. Many of these students are in Japanese school on other days of the week where they put forth, a little bit more effort, and I can't blame them because they know that Japanese is necessary for their future success. Therefore, for the brief hour and a half that I have with these students, it's necessary for me to make this activity as engaging as possible. This lesson is all about reading and writing, but I did my best to personalize it to the student. I hope that it was short enough and entertaining enough to keep their attention. As for the goal of this lesson, I wanted it to be a grammar consciousness raising task, as Wong talked about in his textbook. I hope to make my students aware of how adjectives function within a sentence. I wanted to increase their explicit knowledge of the grammar rules of English, but by not explicitly telling them all of the rules of adjectives. Instead, I would be encouraging my students to discover the rules on their own by performing some sort of interactive task with this written input. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not explicitly telling them, what an adjective is. We had lessons about adjectives before, and I did go over it with them at the beginning of the lesson, as I'll explain later. But instead, I'm not explicitly telling them about, how adjectives function in a sentence. I'm not saying to them, hey, adjectives always come after nouns, or, adjectives come before nouns, or adjectives come after nouns directly after a helper verb. I'm not telling them anything like that. Instead, I wanted them to see these rules demonstrated through what they would be reading and what I would be saying. So piecing together these rules through the input that they would be receiving that day. I titled my lesson Personal Narratives and Using Adjectives, and I'm using the word personal narrative loosely, as I'll explain later. Through this lesson, students will be focused on the use of adjectives while writing a personal narrative of their choice. So here's the general overview of how the lesson went down, and I'll get more into detail later. To start, students would be asked to bring in their favorite book to the class. It could be a graphic novel, picture book, chapter book, whatever it was, as long as it was in English. So for students who forgot to bring a book, which was all of them, again, I can hardly blame them. We only meet like once a week, so it's very easy to forget. They could pick out a book from the books that are provided at the school. We have a huge bookcase full of books of all different levels. So as a class, we would be taking 15 minutes to read our book and identifying any adjectives. We would put sticky notes on any page that had adjectives and write the adjective at the sticky note at the top. After the time is up, we'd be using context clues as a class to come up with definitions for the adjectives. After that part of the assignment is completed, students will be taking the words that they have collected and using these adjectives to write their own personal narrative. The difficult part of the task would be coming up with a personal experience that will fit all of the adjectives that they had found. So that is the general gist of the project. I chose this project because I noticed that there was a need to review adjectives. In Japanese, which is the L1 of most of these students, adjectives often start sentences. As a result, they're left a little confused as to how to use adjectives in their English, whether it be written English or spoken English. Sometimes they'll just add adjectives onto the end of a sentence if they see that more clarification is needed when they're talking, or they'll just not use adjectives altogether. They'll play it safe rather than sorry. I want my students to feel, a little more comfortable using this type of language, experimenting with it, and I thought that this lesson would be a good, low-stress way to do that. Personal narratives tend to get kids writing a little bit more, so I thought that this would be a good stepping stone. My content standard for this lesson was taken right from the Michigan Standards for Education, Grades 4, Standard 4, Part B, which is students will write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective techniques, descriptive details, and that's where I'm focusing, and clear event sequences. And then Part B says that they will use description to develop these experiences and events or to show the responses of characters to situations. So I was really focusing on the descriptive part of that standard, helping them use descriptive language. My language standard was taken from the WIDA standards, and I've never used the WIDA standards before, but I thought that was really interesting. It was taken from the speaking and writing section, sentence dimension level 3, which is developing. So for this standard, with instructional support, English language learners will be able to produce simple and compound grammatical structures with occasional variation and sentence patterns across all content areas. So I wanted them to really focus in on the sentence level. Now, obviously, with COP standards, you have to explain your objectives to your students, but that is not exactly what I communicated to my students. I had a professor once tell me, Professor Livernoy once told me that when communicating your standards to your students, you should do so in student-friendly language. So I wouldn't say all those complicated words that I barely understand. I would have to take into account my audience, and to make sure that they understand the goals, I had to use language that was appropriate to them. So this is kind of what my introduction sounded like. I said something like, all right, everybody, let's clear our desks. For our next activity, you are only going to need a pencil or a pen. If you have a book from home, please get out your book. Now, a couple of lessons ago, we talked about adjectives. Does anybody remember what an adjective is? And obviously at this point, I was met with complete silence, to which I said, that's okay, that's no problem. Does anybody remember what a noun is? And at this, a couple of students raised their hands, and we pieced together the answer of person, place, or thing, which is what I wrote on the board. And I then asked for examples of all of these categories. Now, this took time, but it got students talking, and it got them building their background knowledge about this grammatical subject. So I got a couple of people, a couple of places, a couple of things, and those were all written on the board. When we had a good list going, I started asking questions. So I said, okay, let's take one of our nouns. Let's take the word school. How can we describe the word school? What does our school look like? And then I let them brainstorm. I wrote up all the answers, big, large. One person said crazy. That's fine. So I wrote that up on the board. And then we got to the word flower, and I got the words beautiful, pink, purple, all of the colors basically went there. Small. I went through the whole list, and at the end I said, all of these words that we came up with, all of these describing words, words that explain our nouns, these are our adjectives. And obviously I got the of recognition. They did remember this. And then I said, today we are going to be doing a project that is all about adjectives. At the end of the day, I want you to be able to write a small story, a little baby story about you that uses adjectives. Why do you think using adjectives or describing words in our story is important? And at this time, students gave responses like, it makes the story better, or it is interesting. All really good answers that I encouraged. So then I went on to say, the first part of our activity is all about finding adjectives in our books. Let's go all get up and go pick out a book from our bookshelf. Obviously, the kids are ecstatic to get up out of their seat and go to the bookshelf in the other room. It actually took them a couple of minutes to focus them when we were on the bookshelf so they could pick a book, go back to the classroom. When we got there, back to the classroom with everybody had their book, I focused on building background knowledge. All of my students had picked out pretty popular books. One student I remember chose Art Teacher from the Black Lagoon, and another one of my students had actually read a book in that series. So they got a chance to share what they thought the other student's story would be about, and we all kind of went back and forth like, oh, I've read your story, I haven't read yours, stuff like that, just to get them talking about the books. And then I said, all right, awesome, let's take a look at the cover of our book. What words can we use to describe the picture that we see there? And sure enough, everybody had a picture on their book. So we all went around the table, 6 of us, and we all took turns sharing some describing words. Some people didn't use describing words, that's fine, to talk about what we saw on the cover. I got responses like cool, crazy, fun, pretty simple adjectives, but also a pretty good starting point. Then we got into our structured input activity. So while reading, they would be placing sticky notes everywhere they saw adjectives. And while these students might not be producing the sentences themselves, the focus is not on producing anything at this point. The focus is on understanding the adjectives in the input they receive and being able to identify them. With this activity, there are clear right and wrong answers. Is an adjective or it's not, so the students were receiving definite feedback as they went along with this activity. This is called a referential activity, which means that the students had to pay attention to the form of the sentence in order to understand what was being communicated to them. The activity went about as well as I thought it would. Most students attacked the assignment and saw 5 or 6 adjectives in their reading. Every so often, a student would raise their hand, point to a word, and ask, is this an adjective? To which I would respond, is it describing something? If the answer was yes, I would ask, okay, what is it describing? Now, asking questions like this helped the student answer their own questions. I wasn't explicitly telling them the rules of adjectives, but based off of the questions that I was asking, they were able to piece these together, the rules on their own. I wanted each student to get at least 3 adjectives. I have one student who has been in the United States for, I want to say 2 months, so she's fairly new to the English language. So she really relied on her pocket translator that she had with her. So I worked mainly with her, while the other students would step in occasionally to ask questions. So this whole process took a little bit longer than I was anticipating. It took about 15 or 20 minutes. When we got to the structured practice activity, that came next. While I was helping the one structured student, struggling student, I was also doing the activity by myself in 3 other books. In one book, I had pulled the adjectives old, funny, and green. From another, I pulled the adjectives small, fast, and big. And from the other, I had purple, beautiful, and amazing. I told the students to pick 3 adjectives out of the list that they came up with in their own book. And while they were doing that, I wrote the old words old, funny, and green that I had pulled from my book up on the board. And then I said something like, okay, these are the 3 adjectives that I came up with from my book. I need to come up with a story that uses all 3 words. Now I'm going to try to start with thinking of something that is old and green. And then I said, oh, okay, I know. I once had an old green car. So I wrote on the board, I had an old car. My car was green. My friends thought the old green car was funny. So I circled all of the adjectives that I had pulled from my book and in my short story. At this point, some students, they got it. They nodded and started work on their own piece. I did not direct them to, but they knew what the rules were. But I decided to go ahead and model it again with the words small, fast, and big. So I erased everything I had on the board and wrote small, fast, and big right up on there. But this time I said, maybe I'm stuck on how to use the word fast. I know, I can look back in my book. So I opened the book that I had pulled fast from, and in the book, the sentence was, it's like the fast race car sped around the track. And I wrote that up on the board. And so I said, what I can do is I can change some words in this sentence to fit me. So I wrote on the board, the fast cat ran around the house. So I kept the sentence structure the same, but I just changed out the nouns as necessary. So I wrote, the fast cat ran around the house. He was very big. He ate the small mouse. I then told the students that it is okay to look back at your book for some extra help. That's why we have our books here today. We continued on with the structured practice activity by doing another example. So I wrote on the board, purple, beautiful, and amazing, and told the class that we would be doing this one all together. I passed out some paper and asked the students if they could think of anything, think of a story that used the words purple, beautiful, and amazing. I left the book that I had pulled those words from on the desk so they could take a look at it if they needed. Most students wrote a one sentence response of something like the flower is purple, beautiful, and amazing, or the dress is purple, beautiful, and amazing, which I thought was a really good start for the level that they were at, and I told them so. For some of the more advanced students, I asked if they could break it up into 3 sentences, and most of them could. After I checked everyone's, I asked if there were any questions at that point, but everybody seemed to get it pretty well. I know I did take a long time explaining this step and modeling it, but that's a really important part of structured practice. I wanted to be sure that everybody got it and that everybody had enough time to ask questions if they needed. Because I took so long, some students were almost finished with their own work. They had been doing it in between breaks, and I was seeing that more than a couple were looking back at their own books to help model the sentences, which was exactly what I wanted them to do. So my output assessment activity, that was the final piece of writing that they presented me at the end. In all honesty, because of their level and the limited time that we had, I was expecting 3 to 4 sentences from each student. Most all of the students got there, no problem. Some students presented sentences that were not connected in any way. They were 3 completely separate sentences, but they used the adjectives correctly, so I was okay with it. The main goal of this activity was for my students to be able to produce output that, as Wong states, promotes conscious awareness of language and language use. I wanted the students to be hyper aware of their describing words to make an active effort to use them. This was all meant to encourage literacy and to encourage fluency in the long run. We have to start somewhere. So at the end of the lesson, for my little concluding thing, I asked the students one more time what an adjective was, and I got an answer from everyone instead of the silence that I was met with at the beginning. I told them to keep their writing in their backpacks for next week's class because I was going to be working on expanding their stories with them a little bit more in a different lesson. I asked them if they had any questions about anything we had done that day, but nobody did. In actuality, I had also brought cookies for that day because I was originally planning on recording. My big plan was to say something like, okay, if you focus on Anna and don't look at the camera that's at the back of the room, you're gonna get a cookie at the end of class. But we didn't get to record, and I wasn't gonna let cookies go to waste. So I passed out the cookies and thanked them for the hard work that they had put into that activity. And that's the gist of my lesson. As I mentioned before, please feel free to ask for any clarification if you need it or any more specific examples. And thank you for bearing with just listening to me in my kitchen. Thank you for listening.